The sun sets over the Giza Plateau, casting shadows that have stretched across these sands for thousands of years. As the heat of the day dissipates, replaced by the cool, thin air of the Egyptian night, we find ourselves standing before the last of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid. It is a structure that defies easy explanation. For centuries, we have been told a singular story, a story of bronze tools, of copper saws, of hemp ropes and wooden rollers. We are told of a civilization, barely out of the Stone Age, that suddenly, almost overnight, mastered the physics of moving blocks weighing as much as a modern locomotive. We are told it was a tomb for a pharaoh named Khufu, built over 20 years by a workforce of tens of thousands. But tonight, as the stars align over the apex of the stone, we are going to set that story aside. We are going to step into the what if. What if the history we were taught in school is only the surface of a much deeper, much older truth? What if the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids, but rather they found them? Let the mind go quiet. Let the logic of the modern world drift away. Imagine the desert not as a graveyard of a dead culture, but as a silent witness to a story we are only just beginning to remember. To understand why we question the origin of these stones, we must look closer than the naked eye usually allows. We must look at the precision. The Great Pyramid is composed of roughly 2.3 million stone blocks. Some of these blocks, particularly those in the King's Chamber, are made of red granite. They were quarried in Aswan, over 500 miles to the south. Each of these granite beams weighs between 25 and 80 tons. In the traditional narrative, these massive stones were loaded onto wooden barges, floated down the Nile, and then dragged up a ramp and set into place with such accuracy that you cannot fit a human hair or a credit card between the joints. But here is the thing. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north, within 3/60ths of a degree. This is a level of accuracy that modern engineers struggle to achieve with GPS and laser levels. To achieve this, the builders didn't just need muscle. They needed a profound understanding of the Earth's circumference, the movement of the stars, and the mathematics of the sphere. If we look at the timeline of human development, this level of sophistication appears like a ghost in the machine. Before the Great Pyramid, there is no evidence of a learning curve. We don't see a long history of failed Great Pyramids where the builders were practicing their math. We see the Step Pyramid of Djoser, which is impressive, but it is a pile of small, manageable bricks compared to the megalithic mastery of Giza. It is as if the highest peak of architectural achievement happened at the very beginning, and everything that followed, the later pyramids of the Middle and New Kingdoms, was a pale imitation. They were smaller, more fragile, and they eventually crumbled into mounds of rubble. In every other field of human endeavor, we see progress. We see the Wright brothers' glider leading to the jet engine. We see the abacus leading to the supercomputer. But in Egypt, we see a devolution. The further back you go, the more sophisticated the stoneworking becomes. This suggests a possibility that many find uncomfortable. It suggests that the Great Pyramid wasn't the beginning of a civilization, but perhaps the final crowning achievement of one that came before. Now, walk with me, in your mind, into the heart of the Great Pyramid. The air is heavy here. It is cool, smelling of dust and ancient, still time. You move through the Grand Gallery, a sloping cathedral of stone, until you reach the King's Chamber. In the center of this room sits a box. We call it a sarcophagus. It is carved from a single block of rose granite. If this was a tomb, Where are the inscriptions? Where are the prayers for the dead? Where are the images of the gods waiting to usher the pharaoh into the afterlife? The walls of the king's chamber are blank. They are smooth, somber, and silent. When the first explorers entered this chamber, they found the box empty. There was no mummy. There was no gold. There were no funerary goods. Mainstream archaeology tells us that grave robbers took everything. But the granite lid of the box, if there ever was one, was never found. And the box itself? It is slightly wider than the entrance to the chamber. This means the box was placed there while the pyramid was being built around it. Think about that. If you were a grave robber, how would you carry a multi-ton granite lid out through those narrow ascending passages? And why would a pharaoh, who spent 20 years building a monument to his immortality, leave the most important room in the structure completely devoid of his name? What if this chamber wasn't meant for a body? What if the granite box wasn't a coffin, but a component? The granite used in this room is high in quartz crystal. Quartz is piezoelectric, meaning it can convert mechanical pressure into electrical energy. The chamber is tuned to a specific frequency, a deep, resonant hum that vibrates in the chest of anyone who stands within it. If we stop looking at the pyramid as a building and start looking at it as a machine, the story changes. It becomes a tool for resonance, for energy, or perhaps for something even more profound that we have forgotten how to use. Now, let us leave the dark interior of the pyramid and walk toward the Great Sphinx. It sits in a hollow, its lion body stretched out across the sand, staring eternally toward the rising sun on the spring equinox. For decades, we were told the Sphinx was carved by the pharaoh Khafra around 2500 BC. But in the 1990s, a geologist named Robert Schoch noticed something that changed the timeline forever. He looked at the enclosure walls surrounding the Sphinx, the deep vertical grooves worn into the limestone. To a geologist, these aren't windswept marks. Wind and sand create horizontal scalloped patterns. These vertical undulating ripples are the unmistakable signature of heavy, sustained rainfall. Here is the problem. Egypt has been a desert for at least 5,000 years. To find a period of history where there was enough rain to scar limestone that deeply, you have to go back. Way back. You have to go back to the end of the last ice age, at least 10,000 years ago, when the Sahara was a lush, green savanna. If the Sphinx shows signs of water erosion, it means the Sphinx was already standing when the rains were falling. It means the Sphinx is twice as old as the Egyptian civilization itself. Imagine the first dynastic Egyptians arriving at the Giza Plateau. They find these colossal, weathered structures already half buried in the sand. They see them as the work of the gods. They clear the sand, they repair the stones, and they claim them as their own. They didn't build the pyramids, they inherited them. If we accept the possibility that the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids are older than the pharaohs, we are forced to confront a haunting question. Who were the original architects? And how could an entire civilization capable of moving mountains of stone simply vanish from the face of the earth? To find the answer, we have to look at the climate of our planet roughly 12,800 years ago. At that time, the Earth was beginning to emerge from the last ice age. The great glaciers were receding. But then, something sudden and violent happened. In a geological heartbeat, the temperature plummeted back into deep freeze conditions. This period is known as the Younger Dryas. It lasted for about 1,200 years, a blink of an eye in Earth's history, but a cataclysm for anyone living through it. Mainstream science is now beginning to look at the impact hypothesis, the idea that a fragmented comet struck the North American ice sheets. The result would have been biblical. Instantaneous melting of ice, massive tidal waves, and global wildfires. The world as it was known was scrubbed clean. Imagine a global civilization. Perhaps they weren't like us. Perhaps their technology wasn't based on silicon chips and internal combustion, but on sound, vibration, and a deep understanding of the natural world. When the floods came, the coastal cities, where most civilizations settle, were swallowed by the rising oceans. The knowledge, the libraries, and the people were lost to the deep. But there were survivors. They would have sought out high ground. They would have looked for places where they could preserve their most important knowledge in a form that could withstand thousands of years of erosion. They didn't use paper. They didn't use wood. They used the hardest substance they could find. They used stone. When we look at the Giza Plateau through this lens, it stops being a cemetery and starts looking like a time capsule. The geometry of the Great Pyramid contains the dimensions of the Earth. If you take the height of the pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. If you take the perimeter of the base and multiply it by the same number, you get the equatorial circumference. Why 43,200? Because it is a number derived from the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. This isn't a coincidence. This is a message. It is a way of saying to any future civilization, we knew the Earth, we knew the stars, and we were here. As we move deeper into this what if, we must address the sheer physical impossibility of the construction. In the Valley Temple, next to the Sphinx, there are walls built from megalithic blocks. Some of these stones weigh over 100 tons. They aren't just stacked, they are interlocked. They wrap around corners like pieces of a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. Even with the most powerful modern cranes, maneuvering a 100-ton block into a precise, interlocking position is a nightmare of engineering. Yet, the builders of the Valley Temple did it with stones that show no marks of chisels or hammers. If you look closely at the granite in the quarries of Aswan, you can see scoop marks. It looks as if the solid rock was softened, almost like butter, and scooped out with a giant spoon. There are core drills in the granite that show a feed rate. The speed at which the drill bites into the stone, that is 500 times faster than our best diamond-tipped drills today. When you see these marks, the copper chisel theory falls apart. Copper is a soft metal. You cannot cut granite with copper any more than you can cut a steak with a blade of grass. What this really means is that we are looking at a lost technology, not necessarily alien, but human, a branch of human history that mastered the physical world in a way we don't yet understand. Perhaps they use sound. We know that certain frequencies can cause objects to levitate. We know that vibration can shatter stone or make it fluid. The Egyptians themselves spoke of the Zeb Tepi, the first time. They believed their civilization was a legacy handed down from the gods who lived in a golden age before the Great Flood. Could the gods have been the survivors of this lost era? If the pyramids were built by a pre-cataclysmic culture, then the entire Giza Plateau is a map. In the 1980s, researchers pointed out that the three pyramids of Giza perfectly mirror the three stars of Orion's belt. But they don't mirror them as they look today. They mirror them as they looked in 10,450s BC. This date keeps coming up. It matches the water erosion on the Sphinx. It matches the end of the last ice age. It suggests that the plateau was laid out as a giant clock, frozen in stone, pointing us back to a specific moment in time, a moment of great change, a moment when one world ended and another, the one we call history, began. As you listen to this, let the weight of those 12,000 years settle over you. Think of the builders not as primitive laborers, but as a high culture facing their own extinction. They knew they were going away. They knew the water was coming. And so, they built something that couldn't be washed away. They built a mountain of logic and math. They built the pyramids. As we sit in the stillness of the desert night, let's go back inside. Let's look at the Great Pyramid not as a monument, but as a machine. If you walk into any tomb in the Valley of the Kings, you see walls covered in the vibrant paintings and deep-cut hieroglyphs. But more importantly, if you look at the ceilings of those tombs, you see soot. You see the black carbon deposits left behind by the torches and oil lamps the ancient artists used to light their way. But in the Great Pyramid, there is no soot. The walls of the ascending passages and the high galleries are clean. There is no evidence that fire was ever used to light the interior during its construction. This has led some to wonder, how did they see? Did they use a sophisticated system of mirrors to bounce sunlight deep into the bowels of the structure? Or did they have another way to illuminate the dark? If you've felt the weight of these mysteries, stay with us as we peel back more layers of our forgotten past. Subscribe to keep the conversation going, and let me know in the comments. What corner of the world are you drifting off in tonight, and what hour has it reached? The Great Pyramid is a masterpiece of acoustic engineering. The Grand Gallery, a long sloping hall with a vaulted corbelled ceiling, acts as a massive resonator. When you stand at the bottom and make a sound, the echoes don't just bounce, they amplify, they tighten. The granite lintels above the king's chamber, 5 layers of massive stone beams with air spaces between them, act like a giant tuning fork. Engineers who have studied these relieving chambers have noted that they aren't actually needed for structural support. The pyramid is so stable that it could hold twice its own weight without them. So why are they there? Some researchers, like Christopher Dunn, suggest they were designed to vibrate. By capturing the seismic energy of the Earth, the low-frequency hum that the planet produces naturally, the pyramid could have focused that energy into the king's chamber. Think of the granite box in the center of that room. It wasn't built to hold a body. It was built to hold a charge. If the pyramid was a power plant, the queen's chamber below might have been the chemical center. In the walls of that chamber, there are 2 narrow shafts that do not lead to the outside. When researchers sent small robots up these shafts, they found copper handles or electrodes. They also found traces of hydrochloric acid and hydrated zinc. When these 2 chemicals are combined, they create hydrogen gas. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. It is a powerful conductor of energy. If the builders were pumping hydrogen through the pyramid and using the Earth's vibration to excite those atoms, the Great Pyramid becomes something far more advanced than a pile of rocks. It becomes a mesa, a microwave amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. At the very top of the Great Pyramid, there is a flat plateau. The capstone, the pyramidion, is missing. Ancient accounts say it was made of a different material. Some say it was solid gold. Others say it was an alloy called electrum. In electrical engineering, a pointed shape made of conductive metal is the perfect way to draw energy from the atmosphere. We see this today in lightning rods and radio towers. If the Great Pyramid was a wireless energy transmitter, it predates Nikola Tesla by over 12,000 years. Tesla himself was obsessed with the pyramids. He understood that the Earth itself is a giant electrical generator, and he believed that if you built structures in the right locations, at specific nodes of the Earth's magnetic grid, you could provide free, limitless energy to the entire world. Is it possible that Giza was the power hub of a global civilization? Let's look closer at that sarcophagus in the king's chamber. If you take a laser and run it along the inside edges, you find that the corners are cut with a mathematical perfection that is baffling. The radius of the curves in the corners is consistent throughout. To do this in granite, one of the hardest stones on Earth, you need a drill bit that can cut through the material like a hot knife through wax. If you use a hand chisel, the stone chips. It leaves jagged, uneven marks. But the surface of this box is as smooth as glass. When we look at the Serapeum at Saqqara, not far from Giza, we find dozens of these massive granite boxes, each weighing over 70 tons. They are tucked away in narrow underground tunnels where there is barely enough room for a human to stand, let alone a team of hundreds of men to move a 70-ton stone. The lids of these boxes are fitted so perfectly that they create a vacuum seal. Again, there are no inscriptions, no mummies, no gold. If these weren't tombs, what were they? Some suggest they were containers for high-frequency energy or biological materials that needed to be shielded from the radiation of the sun. Whatever they were, they represent a level of high technology that we are only just beginning to recognize. We see the footprints of a giant, but we cannot see the giant itself. We see the tools, but we don't know the hands that held them. The most striking thing about the Great Pyramid isn't what is there, but what is not there. There are no records of its construction. There are no blueprints in the Egyptian archives. Even the Diary of Mira, a papyrus found recently that talks about transporting stones, only describes the transport of limestone for the casing of the pyramid, not the construction of the massive core or the granite chambers. It's as if the Egyptians were the caretakers of a site that was already ancient when they arrived. They added their names, they added their casing stones, and they utilized the structures for their own spiritual purposes. But they didn't build the machine. They just found the keys. To understand why the Giza Plateau exists where it does, we have to look up. We have to look past the smog of the modern world, past the light pollution of Cairo, and see the sky as the ancients saw it. In the History for Sleep, the stars aren't just points of light. They are the gears of a massive celestial clock. And the pyramids? They are the hands of a lit clock, frozen in stone, pointing to a time that history has tried to forget. For decades, the standard explanation for the placement of the three pyramids was simply aesthetic. But in the late 20th century, a researcher named Robert Bauval noticed something while looking at an aerial photograph. The three pyramids of Giza, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure, aren't in a perfectly straight line. The two larger pyramids are aligned diagonally, but the third, smaller pyramid is offset to the left. If you look at the constellation of Orion, specifically the three stars of the belt, Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka, you see the exact same pattern. Two bright stars in a line, and a third, smaller star offset to the left. But it goes deeper than just a visual match. The Great Pyramid is aligned to the cardinal points of the compass with a precision that is almost haunting. But the shafts inside the pyramid, the ones we previously discussed as air shafts, actually point to specific stars. The southern shaft of the king's chamber pointed toward Orion's belt. The southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber pointed towards Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, associated with the goddess Isis. But here is the catch. Because of a phenomenon called precession, the position of the stars in the sky changes very slowly over thousands of years. The stars wobble in a cycle that takes 25,920 years to complete. The shafts in the Great Pyramid don't point to those stars now. They don't even point to them in 2500 BC, the time when Khufu was supposed to be reigning. To find a time when the stars and the shafts were in perfect alignment, you have to go back to 10,450 BC. The first time, Zeb Tepi. This date, 10,450 BC, is the anchor for the theory of Zeb Tepi, the first time. The ancient Egyptians had a king list known as the Turin Papyrus. It doesn't just list the pharaohs we know from history books. It goes back much further. It lists a period of thousands of years where gods and demigods ruled Egypt. Mainstream historians call this mythology. But if it's mythology, why does the archaeology of the Giza Plateau match the mythical date so perfectly? In 10,450 BC, the constellation of Orion reached its lowest point in its 26,000-year cycle. At that exact same moment, the Sphinx, which faces due east, would have been looking directly at its own celestial counterpart, the constellation of Leo, rising with the sun on the vernal equinox, a lion on the ground, looking at a lion in the sky, at a time when the pyramids matched the belt of Orion. Imagine the level of planning required to leave a message like that. You aren't just building a tomb, you are building a timestamp. You are telling whoever comes next exactly when this site was designed. This isn't the math of a primitive people. This is the math of a civilization that understood the Earth as a sphere floating in space. The Great Pyramid's proportions incorporate the value of pi and the golden ratio. If you take the perimeter of the base and divide it by twice the height, you get those pi values. If you take the area of the faces and divide by the area of the base, you find the second pi value. These numbers are the fundamental constants of the universe. They are found in the spirals of galaxies, the petals of a flower, and the proportions of the human body. By building these numbers into the stone, the architects were saying that the pyramid is not apart from nature. It is a part of the earth itself. It is a physical manifestation of the laws of the universe. Some suggest that the pyramid was placed at the exact center of the Earth's landmass. If you draw a line of longitude and a line of latitude that cross the most land on Earth, they intersect at the Giza Plateau. How could a Bronze Age civilization know the geography of the entire planet? How could they know the exact dimensions of the Earth's curvature? They couldn't. Not unless they had been around the world. Not unless they had mapped the coastlines of Antarctica and the Americas long before history says they were discovered. If we are to be true skeptics, we have to look past the grand scale and focus on the small details. We have to look at the marks left behind in the hardest rocks on our planet. Mainstream archaeology tells us that the ancient Egyptians used copper saws and sand to cut granite. But here is the problem. Granite is a 7 on the Mohs scale of mineral hardness. Copper is a 3. You cannot cut a 7 with a 3. It would be like trying to cut a fallen oak tree with a butter knife. You would only wear down the knife. In the early 20th century, the famous Egyptologist Sir William Flinders Petrie found something in the Giza sands that troubled him. It was a granite core, the piece of stone left over after a hole has been drilled. Petrie noticed that the spiral grooves on the granite core were perfectly even and incredibly deep. He calculated that the drill was biting into the granite with a pressure and speed that would require thousands of pounds of force. If you look at these holes today, they aren't jagged. They are smooth. They look like they were made with an ultrasonic drill, a tool that uses high-frequency vibration to melt through stone. We use this technology today in specialized manufacturing, but we are told the Egyptians didn't even have the wheel, let alone high-frequency power tools. What if the magic wands or scepters held by the gods in Egyptian carvings weren't just symbols of power? What if they were tools? In many reliefs, we see the gods holding the was scepter, a long staff with a fork at the bottom and a stylized head at the top. To a modern eye, it looks suspiciously like a tuning fork or a device meant to channel vibration. Let us travel a few miles south of Giza to the desert of Saqqara. Here, underground, lies the Serapeum. It is a series of cold, dark tunnels carved into the limestone bedrock. Inside these tunnels are 24 massive boxes made of Aswan granite, basalt, and diorite. Each box weighs between 70 and 100 tons. Think about the logistics. These tunnels are barely wide enough for the boxes themselves. There is no room for hundreds of men to stand on either side to pull ropes. There is no room for massive wooden rollers. And yet, these 100-ton monoliths were moved into place and set into niches with a precision that defies explanation. But the most shocking part is the finish. If you take a machinist's square, a tool used to measure perfect 90-degree angles, and place it against the inside of these boxes, the light does not shine through. They are perfectly flat and perfectly square to within a few thousandths of an inch. Why would a civilization that supposedly used stone hammers and copper chisels go to such extreme lengths to make the inside of a box perfectly flat? If they were just for burying Apis bulls, as the official story goes, why does the precision match the requirements of a high-tech optical housing or a vacuum chamber? The official story says the Egyptians did this for religious devotion. But a skeptic looks at this and sees a functional requirement. You don't create that level of precision unless the machine won't work without it. Back on the Giza Plateau, on the east side of the Great Pyramid, there is a remnant of a basalt pavement. Basalt is an even harder stone than granite. If you look at the stones in this pavement, you can see the marks of a circular saw. These aren't straight, back and forth marks from a handsaw. They are curved. The striations show that the blade was moving at an incredibly high speed and cutting through the basalt as if it were soft clay. Some of these cuts are over 6 feet long. To make a circular saw blade that large, you need high-grade steel and a power source. You don't do that with copper and sand. What this really means is that we are looking at the ruins of a ruins. The Egyptians found these basalt floors, these granite boxes, and these massive pyramids. They were so impressed by them that they built their entire culture around them. They tried to copy the style, but they could never match the precision. When you look at the later pyramids, the ones we know the Egyptians built, they are made of small mud brick or rough limestone. They don't have the 100-ton blocks. They don't have the mathematical pi proportions. They don't have the star alignments. It is as if someone left a fleet of Ferraris in the desert, and the people who found them tried to build their own cars out of wood and rope. They look similar from a distance, but under the hood, there is no engine. If the pyramids were an isolated mystery, we might be able to dismiss them as a freak occurrence of history. But as we pull back our gaze from the sands of Egypt and look across the oceans, we see the same fingerprints everywhere. Imagine a map of the world. Now, imagine a single straight line that encircles the globe at a 30-degree angle to the equator. On this line, you will find Giza. You will find the ancient city of Petra. You will find Persepolis, the home of the ancient Persians. You will find Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley. And if you continue across the Pacific, you find Easter Island. This is the Great Circle. The odds of these major megalithic sites falling on the same mathematical line by accident are billions to 1. It suggests a global plan, a megalithic grid that was laid out by a civilization that viewed the entire Earth as a single canvas. If you felt the weight of these mysteries, stay with us by subscribing, and I'd love to know which corner of the world you're listening from tonight, and what hour it is where you are. Let us travel in our minds across the Atlantic to the high peaks of the Andes Mountains in Peru. Here, at a site called Sacsayhuaman, we find walls that mirror the construction of the Egyptian Valley Temple with haunting accuracy. The stones here are massive. Some weigh over 120 tons. Like the stones in Egypt, they are polygonal. They have multiple sides and interlock with one another in a complex three-dimensional puzzle. There is no mortar. There is no cement. The stones are held together by nothing but their own weight and the perfection of their fit. During an earthquake, these walls don't crumble. They dance. They vibrate in place and then settle back into their original positions. How did two civilizations, separated by a vast ocean and thousands of years of official history, develop the exact same incredibly difficult building style? Both cultures claimed they didn't build the walls themselves. The Incas told the Spanish conquistadors that the giant walls were there long before they arrived, built by a race of giants or gods who could make the stones soft with the juice of a specific plant or through the power of sound. Here is the skeptic's question. If you were a primitive person with a stone hammer, would you choose to carve a 100-ton block into a 20-sided polygon that must fit perfectly with 10 other blocks? Or would you just carve square bricks? You only choose the hard way if you have a technology that makes the hard way easy. Now, let us move to the mountains of Lebanon, to a place called Baalbek. Here, we find the Trilithon, 3 massive blocks of limestone that form part of the foundation of a later Roman temple. Each of these 3 stones weighs roughly 800 tons. To put that in perspective, a modern heavy lift crane can barely manage 200 tons. To move an 800-ton block from the quarry to the temple site, you would need the combined power of dozens of the world's largest engines. In the quarry nearby, there is a 4th stone, often called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman. It was never finished. It weighs 1,200 tons. The Romans didn't move these stones. They built on top of them. Like the Egyptians, the Romans found a prehistoric foundation of such magnitude that they could only marvel at it. They claimed it was the work of Jupiter, but the stones tell a different story. They tell a story of a culture that didn't see weight as a barrier. Was there a global maritime civilization? A culture of navigators and engineers who traveled the world at the end of the last ice age, setting these anchor points in stone. In Bolivia, at a site called Tiwanaku, there are stones known as the H-blocks. They are made of andesite, an extremely hard volcanic rock. These blocks are carved with right angles and internal grooves that look like they were made with a CNC milling machine. When you look at the H-blocks next to the granite casing stones of the Egyptian pyramids, The visual language is identical. It is a language of precision, of standardized parts, and of high-speed cutting. If we look at these sites as a global network, the purpose of the pyramids begins to shift. They weren't just for Egypt. They were part of a planetary system. Some researchers suggest this system was for communication. Others say it was for stabilizing the Earth's crust during a period of intense geological upheaval. But whatever the purpose, the scale of it is so vast that it dwarfs anything we have achieved in our recorded history. As you drift closer to sleep, think about the silence of those stones. They have sat in the sun and the rain for 10,000 years, watching empires rise and fall like waves on a beach. They don't care about our history books. They don't care about our theories. They are the hard facts of a world we have forgotten. While the pyramids reach toward the heavens, there is an entire world beneath the Giza Plateau that remains largely ignored by the history books. For centuries, rumors have circulated of a vast underground network, a labyrinth of tunnels, chambers, and halls that connect the pyramids to the Sphinx and beyond. If the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids, perhaps they weren't just monuments to the dead, but the ventilation shafts and entry points for a subterranean civilization. We often trust the father of history, Herodotus, when he tells us about the pharaohs, but we tend to ignore him when he describes things that sound too fantastic to be true. In the 5th century BC, Herodotus wrote about a visit to a massive underground complex near the Lake of Meris. He described a building with 3,000 rooms, 1,500 above ground and 1,500 below. He said the underground portion contained the tombs of the kings who built the labyrinth and the tombs of the sacred crocodiles. Herodotus claimed that this structure surpassed even the pyramids in its complexity. He spoke of winding passages and endless wonders. Where is this labyrinth today? In 2008, a group of researchers called the Mataha Expedition used ground-penetrating radar at Hawara. They found evidence of a high-density area beneath the sand. Massive stone walls several meters thick, forming a giant grid of chambers. But despite the data, the Egyptian authorities shut the project down. No excavations were allowed. The official story remains that there is nothing there but solid rock. Why the silence? If we found a 3,000-room stone complex, it would rewrite human history overnight. It would prove that the surface archaeology of Egypt is just the tip of the iceberg. Not far from the Sphinx, there is a deep shaft known as the Osiris Shaft. For years, it was filled with water, hidden from view. When it was finally drained and explored in the late 1990s, it revealed a 3-level system of chambers carved directly into the bedrock. At the very bottom, over 100 feet below the surface, sits a massive granite sarcophagus surrounded by water. The precision of the carving at that depth, where the air is thin and the light is non-existent, is staggering. The official explanation is that it was a symbolic tomb built during the later dynasties. But a skeptic asks, why go to such extreme lengths? Why carve hundreds of tons of rock deep into the water table to place an empty granite box? Unless, of course, it wasn't a tomb. If the Giza Plateau was a machine, as we explored earlier, then these underground shafts might have been part of the plumbing. They might have been used to channel water from the Nile or from ancient underground aquifers into the base of the pyramids to generate the hydrogen or the vibrational energy needed for the power plant. There is a legend that refuses to die. It is the legend of the Hall of Records, a library of a lost civilization buried beneath the pores of the Sphinx. In the early 20th century, the American sleeping prophet, Edgar Cayce, predicted that a chamber would be found containing the history of Atlantis. While many dismiss Case as a mystic, scientists in the 1990s, using seismic surveys, did find a rectangular cavity directly beneath the Sphinx's front paws. It is roughly 12 meters by 9 meters, and it sits about 5 meters down. To this day, it has never been drilled. It has never been opened. Imagine what might be inside. If the gods of the Zep Tepi era knew their world was ending, they wouldn't just leave a stone pyramid. They would leave their knowledge. They would leave the blueprints for the technology that allowed them to move 80-ton stones with the ease of a child playing with blocks. The more we look at Egypt, the more we realize that we are walking on top of an invisible city. In the 1930s, Salim Hassan, an Egyptian archaeologist, excavated a city of tunnels between the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. He found rooms, storage areas, and passages that seemed to serve no funerary purpose. They look functional. They looked like living quarters or workspaces. Could it be that the builders of the pyramids didn't live in mud brick huts on the surface? Could it be that they lived in the cool, shielded environment of the earth itself? Think about the history for sleep. Think about the safety of the dark. For a civilization facing a global cataclysm, whether it was the fires of a comet or the floods of a melting ice cap, the safest place to be is underground. The pyramids may have been the beacons, the antennas, and the power sources for a world that existed beneath the sand. As the desert wind blows across the plateau tonight, it carries the echoes of those empty halls. We see the stones, but we ignore the silence beneath them. We are told the story of the pharaohs, but we feel the presence of something much older, something that is waiting to be found. If we are to believe that a lost civilization was responsible for the Giza Plateau, we have to ask, what happened to their bodies? Where are the architects? When we look at the statues of the earliest Egyptian dynasties, the ones closest to the first time, we see features that don't always match the people who live in the Nile Valley today. We see strange, elongated skulls. We see eyes of striking blue lapis lazuli. We see a physical type that seems to have appeared out of nowhere, fully formed and highly sophisticated. In the Cairo Museum, tucked away in the back of the Amarna collection, are the busts of the daughters of Akhenaten. Their heads are not like ours. They are stretched backward, forming a bulbous, egg-like shape that looks both elegant and alien. Mainstream history says this was cradle boarding, a practice of binding a child's head with cloth to force the skull to grow into a specific shape. They tell us it was a fashion statement, a way for the elite to distinguish themselves from the common people. But a skeptic looks at the volume. When you bind a skull, you can change its shape, but you cannot change its capacity. A normal human skull has a cranial volume of about 1/400 cubic centimeters, but some of the skulls found in the royal lineages of Egypt, and even more strikingly, in Paracas, Peru, have a volume that is 25 to 30% larger than a modern human's. You cannot bind a brain into being 30% larger. This suggests that this wasn't just a cosmetic choice, it was a genetic trait. It suggests a subspecies, or a branch of humanity that possessed a higher brain capacity. In every ancient culture that practiced head binding, they said the same thing. They were trying to imitate the gods. They were trying to look like the beings who brought them civilization, the beings who could move the giant stones and read the stars. If the gods of Egypt had these elongated skulls, it would explain why they were seen as divine. They quite literally had more computing power than the people they were ruling. One of the most startling sights for a visitor to the Louvre or the Cairo Museum is the statue of the seated scribe, or the statue of Ka-Apa. These are masterpieces of Old Kingdom art, dating back over 4,000 years. The eyes of these statues are not painted. They are made of rock crystal, a sophisticated lens that follows you as you move around the room, and they are piercingly blue. Genetic studies on the mummy of Ramses found that he was a natural redhead with fair skin. Studies on other mummies from the early dynasties have revealed DNA markers that are more common in Northern Europe and the Caucasus than in the modern Middle East. How did a fair-skinned, blue-eyed elite end up ruling the Nile Valley 12,000 years ago? The alternative history theory suggests that these were the survivors of the Great Flood we discussed earlier. As the northern ice sheets melted and the oceans rose, the high culture survivors migrated south. They brought their fair skin, their unique genetics, and their high technology to the sun-drenched banks of the Nile. About 12,000 years ago, human DNA went through a bottleneck. Our population plummeted. We nearly went extinct. When we emerged on the other side of that cataclysm, we suddenly, and without any logical explanation, developed agriculture. We developed writing. We developed complex mathematics. The official story says this was a natural evolution. But evolution is slow. Evolution takes millions of years. This was an explosion. It is as if someone handed us a starter kit for civilization. If you look at the Sumerian texts from Mesopotamia, they speak of the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. They describe these beings as having long faces and shining eyes. They say these beings taught them how to measure the movements of the planets and how to build temples of stone. In Egypt, these same beings were the Shem-Su-Hor, the followers of Horus. They were described as semi-divine priests who maintained the sacred knowledge for thousands of years before the first human pharaoh ever sat on the throne. They were the bridge between the world that was lost and the world we live in today. As the centuries rolled on, the god kings began to die out. Their bloodlines became diluted. Their specialized knowledge was lost. The later Egyptians looked at the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx with the same wonder that we do today. They tried to replicate the magic. They built their own pyramids, but they were made of mud brick and rubble. They wrote their names on the ancient granite boxes, hoping to capture some of the old power, but the spark was gone. The masters of the stone had vanished, leaving behind nothing but their empty halls and their strange, silent monuments. As you lie there, drifting toward the edge of sleep, imagine those fair-skinned architects walking through the white limestone streets of ancient Giza. Imagine them looking up at the stars, knowing that their time was short, and knowing that we would be here, thousands of years later, trying to piece together the fragments of their story. They are gone, but their blood and their math still runs through us. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world where the most powerful tool ever created wasn't a hammer, a saw, or a crane. Imagine a world where the primary tool was sound. We have spent so long looking at the pyramids as a triumph of muscle that we have ignored the possibility that they were a triumph of music. To a modern mind, the idea of moving a 70-ton block with a sound wave seems like science fiction. But to the ancients, vibration was the fundamental language of the universe. Every object in this room, every cell in your body, and every stone in the desert has a resonant frequency. This is the specific vibration at which an object naturally wants to oscillate. If you hit that frequency exactly, you can shatter glass, or you can make a massive object become weightless. In the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, researchers have found that the entire room is tuned to a frequency of 440 Hz, or in some measurements, a deep subsonic 117 Hz. When a human hums at a specific pitch in that chamber, the granite doesn't just reflect the sound, it amplifies it. The stone begins to sing. Is it possible that the priests of the Zep Tepi era weren't just chanting for religious reasons? Could they have been using their voices, or perhaps large tuning forks, to create a state of acoustic levitation? We see this today in laboratory settings. Using ultrasonic waves, scientists can make small objects, water droplets, even small animals, float in mid-air. If you scale that technology up, and you have a structure as mathematically perfect as the Great Pyramid to act as an amplifier, weight becomes a relative concept. If you can change the vibration of a stone, you can change how it interacts with gravity. In many ancient legends, from the walls of Jericho to the temples of the Maya, we hear stories of stones that floated into place to the sound of trumpets or chanting. In Egypt, there are ancient texts that describe the word of power, the Hekau. It was said that the gods could move mountains by speaking a single word. To a primitive person, a high-tech acoustic device would look exactly like a magic wand or a sacred word. Think about the scoop marks we discussed earlier. If you subject a hard material like granite to high-frequency vibration, it undergoes a process called thixotropy. It becomes temporarily soft, almost liquid. If the builders had a device that could vibrate the granite at its resonant frequency, they wouldn't need a copper chisel. They could shape the stone like warm wax. They could cut those perfect 90-degree angles in the serapeum boxes with a simple hand tool because the stone itself offered no resistance. But where did the power for this sound come from? The earth is not a silent rock. It is a vibrating bell. It produces a constant low-frequency hum known as the Schumann resonance. The Great Pyramid is situated on a specific point of the Earth's crust, where the tectonic plates and the underground water flows create a high concentration of telluric energy. By its very shape and its massive weight, the pyramid pins the Earth's vibration. It captures that low-frequency hum and, through its internal chambers, steps it up into a usable form. Imagine the Giza Plateau in its prime, not the brown, sandy ruins we see today, but encased in polished white Tura limestone, reflecting the sun like a mirror. Inside, the granite is vibrating, a low, deep hum that you can feel in your bones long before you hear it with your ears. The entire structure is a living, breathing musical instrument tuned to the frequency of the planet itself. Why go to all this trouble? If the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids for power or for tombs, perhaps they built them for us. Sound has a profound effect on the human nervous system. Certain frequencies can induce deep sleep, while others can trigger states of intense healing or expanded consciousness. Many people who spend time in the King's Chamber report out-of-body experiences or a total loss of the sense of time. They describe a feeling of being retuned. As you drift towards sleep, imagine that frequency now, a deep, steady pulse coming from the heart of the pyramid. It is the sound of the earth. It is the sound of the stars. It is a frequency that has been playing for 12,000 years, long after the builders went back into the silence. The stones are not dead. They are just waiting for us to remember the song.